Good morning, Flagler County. We are sitting down with Kaiti Lenhart, the Supervisor of Flagler County Elections, and we're going to be talking about early voting, the local races, and everything you need to know about getting involved in how our county is run. Um, Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Kaiti.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
So can you tell us a little bit about early voting? What is it? When is it? Where can people go?
Yeah, sure. So early voting for this election, for this primary, will be August 10th through the 17th, and we have 4 locations in the county. So anyone can go to any of those 4 locations. And if you have your sample ballot, if you receive this in the mail, you'll have all those locations. We have the Flagler County Public Library, the Palm Coast Community Center. Here at our office, the Supervisor of Elections office, it's in Bunnell in the Government Services Building. And then also, if you're in Flagler Beach, you don't have to cross the bridge. You can go to the Flagler Beach United Methodist Church, and it's on South Daytona Avenue.
Awesome. So there's a spot for everybody then.
Yes.
Can you kind of elaborate as to why early voting is so crucial, especially for our local elections?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we need the turnout, really. That's what it boils down to, is getting people out to vote, because our local community will be decided in this election. There are a lot of races on the ballot that will be decided in the primary. Although unfortunately we only get about 30% turnout as an average. I mean, it was a little bit better during the last primary in the midterm. We finally got 31%, and so I was so thrilled. And that sounds so sad, because honestly, it's 1 in 3 people who, make the decisions of who is in these offices. So we're talking about county commission and city offices and school board. So those are important, and those races could be decided in the primary.
Okay. Um, do you have any idea how many local races could be decided in the early voting
For
period?
this primary, yeah. So that's also listed in your sample ballot. So there, it really depends. Some of them depend on how many votes are cast and how those votes will determine, so who moves forward, or if a race is decided. That's particularly the case in our city of Palm Coast. Mayoral races, also the council member races for 1 and 3. Um, so those are listed here, and it's basically, they run like a nonpartisan election countywide. When there's three or more candidates, if one candidate gets 50% or more, then the election is over.
Okay.
But I mean, it really depends on how the votes fall and how the race goes. I mean, you're looking at races that have, what, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 candidates for mayor. So that's unlikely to be decided in a primary, just because of the number of candidates.
Yeah.
Typically, that would have a general runoff election. And the general also, I mean, the Palm Coast District 1 race and Palm Coast District 3, we're looking at 4 candidates and 3 candidates respectively. So potentially, if one of those candidates in any of those races receives a majority of the vote, um, typically those would be decided. However, like I said, it really depends. Now, the ones that we are sure that will be decided are the universal primary contest, and that is our Board of County Commissioners District 1 race. So that, and people always ask, why is that a universal primary? What does that mean? Basically,
Mhm.
those candidates have the same party affiliation, and they don't have any opposition for the general election. So that means that it's just an open primary for everybody to vote for for that particular race. And that's the County Commission District 1. You'll see it on all the different ballot styles. So that means Democrats, Republicans, and non-affiliated or minor party voters, they can all vote in that race. And that's also the case for school board.
Okay. So a lot of local positions are going to be most likely decided here in
Yeah,
that
the
early
primary is
voting
always our
period.
most important local election.
Okay. Do you have any idea or inkling as to why voter turnout is so low here in specifically in Flagler County for the early voting?
Yeah, that's a good question. You mean for the primary election
Yeah, for
itself?
the primary.
Yeah. So it really has always been, and it our turnout's a little bit higher than the statewide primary turnout. So I mean, that's still nothing to brag about, honestly. I mean, at least it's not the worst turnout in the entire state. I'm glad of that. But I would like to see it 50, 60%. You know, that would be a lot better. At least half the county paying attention to our local races would be excellent because that's your representation. The people who vote in the primary made the decision for those who did not, basically. I mean, if you look at it that way, if you skip the primary, you don't get a say.
Okay. Um, and I know that in the primary, there are some things that are on the ballot, like your local elections. And I know a lot of people are hearing about different things like amendments that they'll be voting on and that. Can you just give a quick rundown of what exactly is on the primary ballot versus what's on the main ballot in November?
Yeah, there is that difference in the general election because that's where you'll see your amendments. There is an amendment in the city of Palm Coast. There's a charter amendment that's been proposed. And of course, you won't see anything about that on your sample ballot because it's not on the primary. And also, there's 6 constitutional amendments that have been proposed. Several of them from citizens' initiatives. So that means groups went around and got the requisite amount of signatures to get a proposition on the ballot. And others were placed there by the legislature. So there's a kind of a 3-3 split on that. But those 6 amendments will be on the general election ballot. Also on the general, we'll see our mosquito control district races. Those are special districts are called. They're very special. And also the special districts include our community development districts. So those are the neighborhoods that really have an elected board. It's kind of like an HOA, but the people on those boards are elected and they have a special taxing district for the actual community. So we're looking at Dunes, CDD, so that's Hammock Dunes, and also Grand Haven will have their own race. And I think there's also a race in Deer Run, so that is the Grand Reserve community.
Okay.
Mhm.
I want to kind of shift gears a little bit into the mail-in voting. And I
Okay.
know that that pertains both to the primary and the general election. So can you elaborate on mail-in voting, the safety measures that the elections office utilizes to maintain voter integrity and all of that? Can you just give us a
Yeah,
rundown?
of course. So in order to vote by mail, you have to be a registered voter. So let's start there. And in order to register to vote, you have to be a U.S. citizen and a resident of our county. So all of those checks have to be, you know, in place. Check those boxes, right? So then also to vote by mail, you have to have shown an ID. So unless you have registered by mail and never shown ID, that means you never voted in person. You never came to the office to show your ID in person. Didn't go to the DMV to show your ID when some people register through DMV
Mhm.
in that way. So if no one has ever seen an ID from someone, they can't vote by mail, not without showing their ID. So they have to send in a copy of their ID, sign an affidavit. It's quite a process and a lot of paperwork for someone who's never shown ID to vote before. So those persons have a special type of ballot. We don't have that many of them typically in an election cycle. But anyway, so that's a whole nother set of requirements that someone would have to meet. But then to request to vote by mail, if you do that in writing, you have to sign the request form, and we check that signature on the request form to make sure that it matches the voter registration signature that we have on file
Okay.
before the request is even placed, before a ballot's mailed. Like on the front end, we're checking that. So if there's any mismatch between the signature on the request, then we, reach out to the voter to say, hey, is this really you? Did you request a ballot? Right?
Mhm.
And then once the ballot is mailed out and we receive it back, we check the signature on the return envelope to make sure that matches the voter registration file. So anytime that you have updated your address, even through DMV, anytime that you have voted in person and you sign the signature pad when you're there to vote in person, that signature is captured. Anytime you filled out an application to register to vote, a paper application, we have all those signatures on file. Those are the ones that we use to compare to what we receive back for the mail ballot. Our rejection rate is not terribly high because people who vote by mail tend to be very careful with their signature because they want their vote to count,
Mhm.
obviously. When there is a difference, though, it's escalated for further review. Just also a side note, a very important part of the process is signature verification training. All of my staff and myself included and the entire canvassing board have been trained to detect a forgery or any type of like a duplicate kind of tracing or something like that. It's really detailed training. It's very boring training, I'll be honest. It's like 2 hours. It is not. It is not fun. But you know, it's required and we gladly do it because we want to know more about handwriting analysis. Is really what it is to show how to make that match, right? And
Mm.
what goes into it. And it's very scientific. That's why it's kind of boring, I guess. And also the presenter is really monotone and that doesn't help. So it's kind of a delivery issue. So anyway, so yeah, we check all those signatures. If it doesn't match, the voter has to, you know, they have to fix that. And there's an affidavit again and an ID that's required. They can either come in the office or mail the affidavit with a copy of their ID. So it's pretty involved process. We check every single one of the ballot envelopes to make sure that the signatures are matching. Mhm.
Okay. Um, so with early voting right around the corner, can you tell us what is the cutoff to register for mail-in voting for the primaries?
Okay, so early voting and mail ballot voting are two different things. But if you want to vote by mail and have your ballot delivered to you by mail, then you have to do that before August 8th. And then
Okay.
early voting begins on August 10th. So, and that's 10th through the 17th.
Okay. And registering to vote. I know that in Palm Coast specifically, we've seen a lot of new residents moving here. There's a lot going on. Um, they're coming from different states. Obviously, states have different different ways of doing things. So can you give us some insight as to how Flagler County does the registering to vote? When's the latest you can register to vote to still be able to vote in the primary and then in the general, and just everything that that encompasses for some of the newer residents?
Yeah, sure. That's really the biggest challenge that we have this election cycle, including this primary in general, is that we've had over 18,000 new registrants, new people registered since our last presidential. So that's people who have registered to vote, over 18,000 since 2020. So that's the biggest challenge for us to reach those folks and let them know how voting happens here, how to vote, you know, how to register. Those are really good questions. So most people register whenever they get their driver's license in the state of Florida. Like, let's say a new resident comes, they move in, they get their driver's license, get their motor vehicle license and registration and all that. So we get those electronically from DMV. It's called Motor Voter. It's really great. It's been around for a long time. Also, we try to be out in the community to help people register. There's certain groups out there that are always doing voter registration, civic groups and organizations. So we receive a lot of that through the mail, and then also our voter outreach efforts to reach people, you know, at community events and things like that. So voter registration for us has been on the rise really since it's hard to even find a time where it was going down, honestly. Our county's been growing for a number of years. So that's a good thing. I think that people probably want to know when they move here, you know, what the most like right now, the probably the most popular or common question that we get is why can't I vote, you know, for the Democrat ballot or for the Republican ballot if I'm independent? Because they're coming from a state that had open primaries and Florida's had a closed primary since forever. So that's been the most common thing we have to explain is that when you register to vote, check your party, make sure it's what you need it to be. And for this primary, the registration's closed. That voter registration deadline for party changes, new registrations was July 22nd. So we're past that time now. But going on into the general election, much different than the primary, you can vote however you want. You can vote all the different parties. You can, you know, straight line vote all the way down the ballot, one party if you want, or you can bounce around and vote however. It doesn't matter your party affiliation in a general election. And the deadline to register for the general would be in October. It's October 7th.
Okay. So there's still a little bit of time for people to
Yeah.
get here, get set up, and get registered to vote. Were there any other questions that you wanted to address as far as early voting, mail-in voting, general election, new residents?
Yeah, I think one of the another thing that people probably don't understand because I've seen this happen is that during early voting we have our four sites, right? That includes the library, the community center, our office, and the Flagler Beach location. And then let's say someone voted early in a previous election, and then it comes down to election day. Well, on election day, you have to go to your assigned precinct. And we have a lot of folks showing up at like the library and their early voting site of choice, right? So they show up there to vote on election day, but that's not their assigned precinct. Like if you live in the R section, and you drive all the way down to the library, you're going to be turning around and driving back to Rimfire Elementary. The precinct is closer to home. It's a neighborhood precinct, so they should check. I would really recommend that folks check their voter registration card because that, might be handy. If not, we have a great resource on the elections office website where you just type in your address. It brings your precinct up, that information, that location and everything. It's based on your residential address. So when you vote on election day, it's a little bit different than if you're voting on, during the early voting period. And that's something people get kind of mixed up sometimes. So to save yourself a trip across town and back again, it's a good idea to check. If you're going on election day, make sure you know where you're going.
Okay, one last question about election day, and I'm glad that you brought that up. So since everybody has to go to their to the precinct of their address for their neighborhood, are you able to kind of let people know, is there a trend as to when when the voting times get a little crazier and when they're a little slower so that maybe people can fill in the gaps instead of having a ton of lines towards the end?
You mean for election day?
Yes.
On election day? Okay, so it typically is fairly busy because you have people who are working. I know there's a there's a big retirement community, or group of folks who are retired, and you guys can go anytime. But for those of us who are working, we try to go before work, so before like 7 to 8, because the polls open at 7 a.m. and they close at 7 p.m. So 7 to 8 can be pretty busy. Also around lunchtime tends to be busy from like 12 to 2, say, around that time period. And then the after work crowd, from 5 to 7, it can be pretty busy. So I would say a mid-morning run would be safe, and then maybe go to lunch somewhere. Okay, or after maybe an early, no, it would be a late lunch, early dinner run. So like from 3 to 5 would be a safe time if you're avoiding a line. Although our election day precincts aren't terribly busy usually, because voting trends are moving towards early voting as the more popular in-person voting method. And then also vote by mail has been pretty popular and on the rise even before COVID. We've seen those numbers. It's called convenience voting. Voting on your time instead of having to do it on one day. So you can choose to get your ballot by mail. And a lot of people just vote by mail because they don't want to have to be bothered with trying to find a time during the actual election day to go to their polling place, or they get it as an insurance policy in case that something happens. They just have that in case, and if they don't need it, they just go vote in person anyway. But a lot of folks vote by mail because they need it because they travel for work, or they have a health issue, or their transportation could be an issue. There's a million and one reasons that we hear when people call us and, I won't be in town, I'm traveling, on the phone. We hear from probably everybody in this county is going to call this office at some point this year. And I think I've heard from half of the county already. So yeah, but early voting, I think, is probably going to be the highest turnout method, I think, for this election year. I think we'll see a lot early voting, and maybe not election day. We'll see. Our election day voters really surprise me always,
Okay. And before we conclude this interview, can you just give us a brief recap of all the different dates really fast for
Okay.
the primaries, the general, all the early voting and all of that?
Okay, so I'm really going to focus on the primary for this because I feel is our most important local election. So if you haven't looked at your sample ballot, you don't know what I'm talking about with this sample ballot, I need you to find it. You can go on the elections office website. This is blurring out. I'm really sorry. Go on the elections office website to see the candidate list. And you can click on all the candidate names to learn about them. This is really the most important election, you guys. So I want you to pay attention to your candidates, make your choices, know where you're going. Okay, so if you want to vote by mail, the deadline is August 8th. And then early voting is August 10th through the 17th. It's Saturday through that following Saturday. The hours are 10 to 6 each day at our 4 locations. And then election day is the last day to vote. So if you decide to wait till the last minute, or if you're a traditional election day voter, you know that the election day is August 20th. And find out where you're going ahead of time. Make sure you look up your precinct voting location for election day.
Okay. Well, thank you so very much for taking the time to talk with us about how Flagler County holds their elections. It's been great. It's been educational, and I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Oh, me as well. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to make a video and get out there And hopefully this, reaches someone who was kind of on the fence about the primary or maybe didn't know how important it was. So I'm
Yes.
really hoping to increase our outreach for this and, our turnout ultimately for this election.
Thank you so very much. Thank you guys for watching. You can find this video on our website, on our YouTube, and on our Facebook account.